States. I want to read out to you the first private U.S. response to the Balfour Declaration by Robert Lansing, who was then U.S. Secretary of State. And he wrote a letter to President Woodrow Wilson. He raised 3 objections to the Balfour Declaration. The first 2 make sense, but it's a third point that he raises, which I think will raise a few eyebrows. And it begins, "My dear Mr. President, we are not at war with Turkey, and therefore should avoid any appearance of favouring taking territory from that empire by force. Second, the Jews are by no means a unit in their desire to re-establish their race as an independent people. To favour one of the other faction would seem to be unwise. And then third, for good measure, he said many Christian sects and individuals would undoubtedly resent turning the Holy Land over to the absolute control of the race credited with the death of Christ, otherwise known as deicide. And in fact, there's substantial evidence that many of the leading statesmen at the time believed in this, including Mark Sykes, author of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, who's also one of the champions of the Balfour Declaration and responsible in part for dividing up the Middle East and giving them flags and separate names. And he was an ardent Catholic as well. And in those days, they were brought up theologically thinking that the Jews were responsible for killing Christ, and obviously affected their thinking still, even when they were working. And I'm gonna. This is a quote that Noam mentioned, and then I'm going to end this section with this quote. And this is obviously Louis Brandeis, one of the first Jewish members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And these are the minutes taken down of a meeting between him and Balfour on the sidelines of the Paris Peace Conference. And this is 2 years after the Balfour Declaration was issued, when they were discussing whether to incorporate it into the British Mandate of Palestine. So again, I'm saying in 1902, the idea is first raised by Herzl. It's mentioned by Robert Cecil in 1906. It comes into the fore with the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And again, it's being mentioned in 1919. And as an American, Justice Brandeis was noted as saying, these are the notes written down by Felix Frankfurter, he was confronted with the disposition of the vast number of Jews, particularly Russian Jews, that were pouring into the United States year by year. It was then that by chance a pamphlet on Zionism came his way and led him to the study of the Jewish problem and to the conviction that Zionism was the answer. I should point out that I think it was 1923 or 1924, the US government placed immigration restrictions following on the practice of the British Alien Act. And they kept these restrictions on as well for many years. But I'll get back to that. Now, what was the role of international law? As Noam pointed out, I referred to the very first sentence of the very first declaration adopted by the Zionist Congress in 1897 mentions the words public law. Because the Zionist organization knew that in order to legitimize their claims, international law was integral to the movement. And it's no coincidence that the Balfour Declaration, when it was first read out in Parliament, had no legal basis whatsoever. But that changed when it was incorporated into the mandate and sanctioned by the League of Nations. From that moment, Britain was obliged to implement the policy of Zionism and to encourage Jews to find their national home in Palestine. But of course, this is only one part of the story. There's also the Arab side. And when Zionism emerged in the early 20th century, the Arabs also desired to establish an independent kingdom or confederate of states in the Arabian Peninsula and in what people call the Near East, the Middle East, Western Asia, to break away from the Ottoman Turks, because they were Arab nationalists, spoke a different language, didn't see themselves as being having allegiance to Istanbul. And it was during the First World War when Britain lost the Battle of Gallipoli that the Sheriff of Mecca first sounded out the British government to see if they were interested in forging an alliance to expel the Turks from Arabia. And a messenger was sent by courier to Cairo with a letter that was hand-delivered to someone called Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner there. And to cut a long story short, what the sheriff was asking for was that in return for his support, and he wouldn't issue a declaration of jihad, and he wouldn't actively oppose the British government, and would help their campaign against the Turks. In exchange for that, Britain would recognize the Sheriff of Mecca's rights as being the Hashemite family to certain territories. And there was an argument over which areas were reserved in the correspondence. It became known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, which have been disputed ever since. And it's actually my, I think, 9th university I've spoken at in the United States in the last 2 weeks, and it's bizarre. But this exchange of correspondence, which we think is antiquated today, is the issue that has been raised again and again. I've got some strange emails from people asking me all kinds of questions, and the issue that they raise is this map. Because this map seems to support the Arab interpretation. The issue was whether Palestine was included or excluded in the exchange of letters. And the Zionists, the Israelis have always argued that it was, Israeli scholars have always argued that Palestine was excluded from the pledge, and the Arabs have always argued no, Palestine was included, and then they betrayed the Arabs when they promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine 2 years later in 1917 in the Balfour Declaration, so Palestine became the twice promised land. This map was drafted by the Foreign Office cartographer during the First World War, I think 1919, and it was an interpretation of how he read the pledges. I think it's quite damning because it's not a map produced by the Israelis or the Palestinians or the Zionists and the Arabs, but it's a map produced by the British government interpreting their own obligations, and it clearly shows that Palestine is included in the pledge, and the area excluded was only amounted to northern Syria and Lebanon, where French interests were recognized, the French having an interest in the Christian places and the Maronite community, which they had a sphere of influence there for many years. And I can go into this in more detail if anyone's interested in the questions and answers. But the conclusions of the Political Intelligence Committee of 1919, which was a department of the Foreign Office, came to the conclusion that Palestine had been pledged to the Sheriff of Mecca in 1915. Now, as we know, that 2 years later, a year later, Britain and France concluded what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I mentioned Mark Sykes earlier on. And they kind of divided. So after the Arabs had been promised in these kind of exchange of letters, a confederation of Arab states, subject to reservations. They would not become fully independent entities. Britain and France would always have the final say. But what I think is interesting about Sykes-Picot, because it's usually seen as a betrayal of the Arab national movement, and that might be so, but what I think is interesting is the area, again, Palestine, highlighted in brown here. When you read the actual text, it specifically mentions when negotiating its future status, they would consult with the Russian Empire and everyone else, and the representatives of the Sheriff of Mecca. Now, why would they want to consult with the representatives of the Sheriff of Mecca if he didn't have a claim to it based on the Hussein-McMahon correspondence? This is 1916, Hussein-McMahon correspondence was 1915. The Balfour Declaration was a year later. And I argue this is where the conflict kind of begins, because you have at least two, even if you disagree with the exact clauses in the documents, at least two political communities believed that they had been pledged the same tract of territory, whether they were right or wrong, I think, irrespective. And this leads to a huge mess, because after the First World War, Britain realizes when they meet at the Paris Peace Conference that they've got these different claims, and there's a flagrant contradiction between promising the same territory to two national movements. This is a picture of Prince Faisal, one of the sons of Hussein ibn Ali, on the steps at the Paris Peace Conference. On Prince Faisal's left is Colonel T. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. When Lawrence travelled to Paris, the British government pressed him to stop over in London beforehand, and they wanted him to come to an agreement with Weizmann, who was the leader of the English Zionist group. And what happened at Paris in 1919, that a lot of individuals and groups, heeding Wilson's idea of self-determination, presented themselves. So you had nationalist movements the world over there, and the Zionist organization was given a platform to speak, as was the Arab national movement. What's interesting about the Faisal-Weizmann agreement, and it's still mentioned, in fact it's the only historical agreement of that period mentioned on the website of Israel's foreign ministry, is that it amounts to acquiescence by the Zionist organization to have the right to settle Jews in the land and develop the land. But they are seeking Faisal's acquiescence. They're seeking an agreement from him. Why would they seek that if they didn't believe that he had a claim to the territory in the first place based on these previous agreements? So I think that's quite damning. Now, what happened in 1919, as I said, is this idea of self-determination, or majority rule, as one might call it, came to fore. When Wilson spoke about it, he was responding to Lenin and the rise of the Bolsheviks, who were actually the first to really talk about it in public. And when they were sitting at the Council of Four, which is this kind of round table of, you've got the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom there, and the Italians and the French and the Americans, they're all arguing about how to bring order to the Middle East and how to divide it up, divide the spoils between themselves. And Wilson was essentially saying, no, I don't want you to do the old system. We're not going to annex the territories. We're going to establish a mandate, sacred trust of civilization. We will administer the peoples to eventual self-government. They're not yet there. They're not civilized enough, but they will be after we show them how to govern themselves. The problem, and what Wilson wanted, is he wanted a commission with regards to the Middle East, the A-class mandates. He wanted a commission of inquiry to go to the Middle East to consult the inhabitants of the territory as to their future wishes. And this became known as the King Crane Commission of Inquiry. Because during the First World War, apart from the Balfour Declaration, the British government and the French had issued other declarations promising the indigenous inhabitants self-rule if they supported the uprising. So the commission went to the Middle East, and they consulted various persons, and they came back with many conclusions, but the two principal ones for our purposes was that they opposed the idea of Zionism and establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the Balfour Declaration, and that they opposed Britain being the mandatory power because they didn't trust the old colonial power. They preferred to have the Americans because they liked the idea of Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination. Now, of course, when the British heard about this report and the French, they weren't very happy about it. So they suppressed the document, and it wasn't published for 3 years. In that time, the Balfour Declaration had been incorporated into the mandate and became legally binding. So the issue was kind of moot after that point. So essentially, in Palestine, you had this conflict. You had the Balfour Declaration promising the Jewish people a homeland there, and you have 93% of the population who are Arab and who are asking for self-rule. So it seemed to many that, in fact, self-determination did not apply to Palestine, at least in practice, if not in principle. And this is the opinion of Lord Eustace Percy, who was Balfour's private secretary in 1990. And this is a book. This is from a book called The Responsibilities of the League. And this is what I'll read out to you the full quote. He said, "In Palestine, a country peopled for the most part by an Arab race, whose independence they are equally pledged to recognize and guarantee, a national home is to be created for a people whose only connection with that country for 1800 years was one of historic sentiment and religious tradition. This pledge," referring to the Balfour Declaration, "violates all current ideas of self-determination. It stands isolated and unique among the various phases of settlements." So you can see that one view was that, the British was just going to go ahead and violate the idea of self-determination. And indeed, there was a conflict, there was a tussle of power between George Curzon, who would replace Balfour as Foreign Secretary, over this question, because George Curzon was responsible for the safeguard clause protecting the rights of the non-Jewish community, the Arabs of Palestine, who had a lot of experience administering colonial territories, and he thought the idea was balmy. And in the following, you can see what happens in the following, in a memorandum which Balfour sent to Curzon. It's quite a famous one. Balfour essentially admits that the British government wants to violate self-determination, but it doesn't see how they can do it because of all these other obligations. And a statement begins with the following words. Balfour expressed his opinion that Zionism is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes of far profound import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In his opinion, that was right. Then he goes on to say, "What I have never been able to understand is how it can be harmonized with the Anglo-French Declaration, the League of Nations Covenant, or the instructions to the King Crane Commission of Inquiry." And the reason was all these instructions and declarations all spoke of self-determination. So you had this clash, and he didn't know how to resolve it. So essentially what